Imagine surviving the most famous shipwreck in history. But that's not the strangest part. The real mystery is this. The woman the world would later call the unsinkable Molly Brown wasn't supposed to be on that ship at all. She was a poor Irish immigrant's daughter from a dusty river town, a woman who had fought her way out of poverty and somehow ended up aboard the most luxurious ship ever built. Then, in the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic, everything went wrong. The Titanic struck an iceberg. Panic spread across the decks. Lifeboats were launched into the Black Ocean, but while wealthy passengers froze in fear and crew members struggled to keep control, one woman refused to sit quietly and wait for death. She argued. She shouted. She took command of a lifeboat in the middle of the night, and what she did next would turn her into a legend. But here's the twist most people don't know. The woman history remembers as Molly Brown never actually called herself Molly. So, how did a poor girl from Missouri become the most famous survivor of the Titanic? And why did her story almost disappear from history? This is the incredible true story of Margaret Brown, the woman who refused to sink. Long before the world knew her as the woman who survived the most famous shipwreck in history, Margaret Brown was simply a little girl born into poverty. She entered the world on the 18th of July, 1867, in the small river town of Hannibal, Missouri. The town sat along the wide, muddy waters of the Mississippi River, a place where steamboats came and went, and where dreams of opportunity often collided with the harsh reality of working-class life. Margaret Tobin, her birth name, was the daughter of Irish immigrants. Her parents, like thousands of others who had crossed the Atlantic in the 19th century, arrived in America carrying hope, but very little else. They had fled Ireland searching for something better: steady work, safety, and the chance to build a future for their children. What they found instead was struggle. Her father, John Tobin, worked long hours at the Hannibal gasworks. It was exhausting, dangerous labor, and the pay was barely enough to keep the family fed. Every day, he left home before sunrise and returned long after the sky had turned dark over the Mississippi. Margaret's mother, Johanna Collins Tobin, carried the weight of the household. She cooked, cleaned, and raised a house full of children in a cramped wooden home that stood in one of the poorest parts of town. Life in the Tobin household was crowded from the beginning. Both John and Johanna had been married before, each bringing a daughter from their previous marriages. Together they had more children, filling the small house with noise, arguments, laughter, and constant movement. Money was always scarce. The family rarely had extra food, and new clothes were a luxury the children almost never saw. Winters were especially difficult when the cold winds from the river cut through the thin walls of their home. Yet despite the hardships, the Tobin family shared something many wealthier families did not: a fierce loyalty to one another. Evenings often brought a brief moment of peace. After long days of work and chores, the family would gather together inside their small home. Stories of Ireland were passed around like treasured heirlooms, tales of green hills, distant relatives, and the life their parents had left behind. For young Margaret, those stories planted something powerful inside her. She grew up listening to them while staring out at the Mississippi River, watching boats travel to distant cities she had never seen. Each passing steamboat seemed to whisper the same message: the world was far bigger than Hannibal. And somewhere beyond that river, a different life might be waiting. Margaret Tobin grew up in a world where children learned about hardship very early. Hannibal, Missouri, in the late 19th century, was not the charming river town people would later imagine. Behind the busy docks and passing steamboats, most families lived in poverty, working long hours just to survive. For immigrant families like the Tobins, life was especially difficult. From a young age, Margaret understood that nothing in life would be handed to her. The neighborhood where she grew up was filled with workers, laborers, factory hands, dock workers, and immigrants who had come to America searching for opportunity. Instead, many found themselves trapped in exhausting jobs with little pay and even fewer chances to rise above their circumstances. Children in these neighborhoods rarely had the luxury of a carefree childhood. Margaret attended school for a time, but education often had to compete with the needs of the family. Every pair of hands mattered. Even the youngest children were expected to help wherever they could. By the time she reached her teenage years, Margaret had already begun working. Like many young women in Hannibal, she found employment in a tobacco factory, one of the few places willing to hire girls from poor families. The work was repetitive and tiring. Long rows of workers sat for hours, rolling tobacco leaves, their fingers stained and their backs aching by the end of each shift. The air inside the factory was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of tobacco and dust. But Margaret endured it. Day after day, she worked beside other young women whose lives looked much like her own. Most of them expected to follow a predictable path, continue working, marry a local laborer, and spend the rest of their lives in the same small town. Margaret, however, felt something different stirring inside her. She watched the riverboats arrive and depart. She listened to travelers talk about distant cities, places like Street, Louis, Denver, and even lands beyond the ocean. The world sounded enormous compared to the narrow streets of Hannibal. While others accepted the life they had been given, Margaret quietly began imagining a different future. She wanted more than endless factory shifts and a lifetime spent in the same crowded neighborhood. What she didn't know yet was how she would escape. But one thing was certain: the determined girl from Hannibal was already beginning to believe that her life would not remain small forever. By the time Margaret Tobin reached her late teens, one truth had become painfully clear to her. If she stayed in Hannibal, her future would likely look exactly like her present. Another long life in the factories. Another generation struggling to survive in the same narrow streets. Marriage to a local laborer, children raised in the same crowded houses, and the same cycle of hardship repeating itself again and again. For many people in her neighborhood, that life was simply accepted. But Margaret was not like most people. There was something restless inside us, a stubborn determination that refused to settle. Even after long days inside the tobacco factory, she found herself staring out toward the Mississippi River, watching the endless movement of steamboats heading toward distant cities. Each boat seemed to represent possibility. Travelers who stepped off those ships spoke of places that sounded almost unbelievable to a girl who had never left Missouri. They talked about booming towns in the West, places where silver and gold had been discovered, where entire cities were being built almost overnight. One place in particular kept appearing in these conversations: Colorado. Out in the Rocky Mountains, mining towns were growing rapidly. Workers from all over the country were heading there, hoping to strike it rich in the silver mines. The towns were rough, unpredictable, and often dangerous, but they also offered something Hannibal did not: opportunity. Around this time, Margaret's older brother, Daniel Tobin, began talking about leaving Hannibal to find work in the West. Like many young men of that era, he was drawn by the promise of the mining towns. When Margaret heard about his plans, a thought immediately formed in her mind. Maybe this was her chance. Leaving home was not an easy decision. Hannibal, despite all its hardships, was the only world she had ever known. Her family was there, and so were the memories of her childhood. But staying meant accepting a future she no longer wanted. Margaret chose differently. In 1886, at just 19 years old, she packed what little she owned and prepared to leave Missouri behind. Together with her brother, she would travel west toward the growing mining town of Leadville, Colorado. She had no money, no powerful connections, and no idea what awaited her there. But she carried something far more important: a fierce belief that her life could become something greater than the narrow streets of Hannibal. And in a town built on silver, ambition, and risk, that belief was about to change everything. In the year 1886, 19-year-old Margaret Tobin stepped away from the only life she had ever known. Hannibal, Missouri slowly disappeared behind her as she began the long journey west. The river town of her childhood, with its crowded streets, factory smoke, and familiar faces, was now becoming part of her past. Ahead of her lay a completely different world. Margaret traveled with her brother Daniel Tobin, who, like thousands of young men during that time, had been drawn by the growing mining industry in the Rocky Mountains. Stories of silver discoveries had spread across the country, and entire towns were rising almost overnight around the mines. One of the most famous of these towns was Leadville, Colorado. Nestled high in the mountains at more than 10,000 feet above sea level, Leadville was one of the fastest-growing places in America. In just a few short years, it had transformed from a quiet mining camp into a booming city filled with fortune seekers, laborers, gamblers, and entrepreneurs. The promise of silver had attracted people from everywhere. Miners arrived, hoping to strike rich veins in the mountains. Merchants opened stores to sell supplies. Railroad workers pushed new tracks into the rugged terrain. Wealthy investors arrived looking to turn the mining boom into massive profits. But for every success story, there were hundreds of people struggling to survive. The journey to Colorado itself was not easy. Travel during the late 19th century was slow and uncomfortable. Long train rides carried passengers across vast plains and through rugged landscapes before finally climbing into the Rocky Mountains. For Margaret, the trip must have felt both thrilling and frightening. She was leaving behind everything familiar and stepping into a place known for harsh weather, dangerous work, and a population dominated by rough miners and fortune hunters. Yet when she finally arrived in Leadville, she saw something she had never witnessed before: opportunity everywhere. The streets were alive with movement wagons carrying mining equipment, workers rushing between businesses, saloons filled with loud voices and laughter, and merchants selling goods to the growing population. Unlike Hannibal, this was a place where people believed their fortunes could change overnight. Margaret quickly realized that Leadville was not simply another town. It was a place where ambition ruled everything. And for someone who had spent her life dreaming of a bigger future, there may have been no better place to start again. When Margaret Tobin first arrived in Leadville, Colorado, she quickly realized that life in a booming mining town was very different from anything she had experienced before. Leadville was not a quiet place. The streets were crowded with miners covered in dust after long shifts underground. Wagons rattled across the rough roads carrying tools, timber, and heavy ore pulled from the mountains. Saloons stayed open late into the night, filled with loud voices, gambling tables, and the constant clinking of glasses. It was a town built on hope and risk. Some men arrived dreaming of sudden wealth, believing they might strike a rich vein of silver and change their lives forever. Others came simply looking for work, willing to endure the dangerous conditions of the mines just to earn enough money to survive. For many families, life in Leadville was still difficult. Winters were brutal in the high mountains, and the cost of living was often high. The mining companies controlled most of the work, and laborers frequently struggled with low wages and dangerous conditions. Margaret, however, was not a miner. Like many young women who came to Leadville, she searched for work in the businesses that supported the growing town. Eventually, she found a job at a dry goods store where she helped sell clothing, fabric, and everyday supplies to the residents of the bustling mining community. It was not glamorous work, but compared to the tobacco factory in Hannibal, it offered something important: a chance to meet people from all walks of life. Every day, customers passed through the shop, miners buying new boots, wives purchasing fabric for dresses, travelers passing through town, and businessmen discussing investments in the silver mines. Margaret listened carefully. She learned how the mining industry worked, how fortunes were won and lost, and how the entire town seemed to revolve around the unpredictable flow of silver from the mountains. But more importantly, she began to understand the people around her. She saw the exhaustion in the faces of miners who worked long hours underground. She heard the worries of families struggling to make ends meet. And she witnessed the stark contrast between wealthy mine owners and the laborers risking their lives every day. These experiences shaped Margaret in ways she could not yet fully understand. The girl who had grown up poor in Hannibal already knew hardship. But in Leadville, she was beginning to see the larger forces that shaped people's lives, money, power, and opportunity. And somewhere in this rough, unpredictable mining town, she was about to meet someone who would change her life forever. Leadville was a town where lives could change quickly. Some people arrived with nothing and left rich. Others came chasing fortune and disappeared just as quickly, swallowed by the harsh realities of mining life. In a place like this, chance encounters could shape an entire future. For Margaret Tobin, one such encounter was about to happen. Among the thousands of men working in the mines around Leadville was a quiet but determined miner named James Joseph Brown. Unlike many fortune seekers who came west dreaming of instant wealth, James was different. He had been born into poverty himself and understood the value of hard work. Instead of gambling his wages away in the saloons that lined Leadville's streets, he spent most of his time working and studying the mining business. James was known among his fellow workers as a thoughtful man. He worked underground in dangerous conditions, just like the other miners, but he also paid close attention to the geology of the mines. He believed that success in mining wasn't only about luck, it was about understanding the rock, the veins of ore, and the hidden patterns inside the mountains. It was this determination that first caught Margaret's attention. The two met sometime after Margaret had settled into life in Leadville. Their backgrounds were surprisingly similar. Both had grown up poor, both understood the struggles of working-class families, and both carried a quiet belief that their lives could become something more than what they had been born into. But what truly set their relationship apart was something rare for the time. Margaret did not want to marry simply for money. Many young women in mining towns hoped to find wealthy men who had struck silver or gold. A rich husband could mean security, comfort, and a life far removed from the struggles of labor. Margaret had a different idea. She once made it clear that she wanted to marry for love, not wealth. And James Brown, despite his modest life as a miner, seemed to share the same values she held. Their connection grew steadily. In a rough town filled with uncertainty, they found something steady in each other, a shared understanding of hardship, ambition, and resilience. Neither of them knew it yet. But this partnership, built not on wealth but on mutual respect and determination, was about to place them on a path that would eventually lead far beyond the dusty streets of Leadville. And one day, that path would carry Margaret Brown all the way to the deck of the most famous ship ever built. By the late 1880s, life in Leadville continued to move at the frantic pace of a booming mining town. New businesses opened almost every week, and the streets remained crowded with workers chasing the promise of silver hidden deep inside the Rocky Mountains. For Margaret Tobin, however, something far more important than the mining boom was happening in her personal life. Her relationship with James Joseph Brown had grown stronger with time. The two shared many of the same experiences. Both came from poor families and understood the struggles of working-class life. Neither of them had been born into wealth, and both had spent years working hard simply to survive. Yet, despite their humble beginnings, they carried something powerful inside them: determination. James continued to work as a miner, spending long days underground in dark tunnels carved deep into the mountains. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Cave-ins, explosions, and accidents were constant risks that every miner faced. But James was known for his intelligence and persistence. Unlike some miners who relied purely on luck, he carefully studied the rock formations around him. He believed that understanding the geology of the mines could reveal hidden veins of ore that others might overlook. Margaret admired this about him. She saw that James was not only hardworking, but also thoughtful. He was a man who believed that patience and knowledge could change a person's future. In 1886, Margaret Tobin and James Joseph Brown were married. Their wedding was simple. Far from the grand ceremonies enjoyed by wealthy families in the eastern cities, there were no elaborate decorations, no famous guests, and no expensive gowns. But what their marriage lacked in luxury, it made up for in sincerity. Margaret had never wanted to marry for money. In a town where many people dreamed of finding wealthy partners, she had chosen love instead. At the time, James was still just a miner earning modest wages. Their life together began in a small house in Leadville, surrounded by the noise and energy of the mining town. The early years of their marriage were not easy. Money was limited, and the future was uncertain. Like many young couples in Leadville, they had to rely on patience, hard work, and faith that things might eventually improve. Yet there was something unusual about the Browns. Even during difficult times, Margaret refused to accept that their lives would always remain small. She believed that opportunity could appear when least expected, and deep inside the mountains surrounding Leadville, an opportunity was slowly waiting to reveal itself, one that would transform the Browns' lives forever. In the early years of their marriage, Margaret and James Joseph Brown lived much like countless other couples in Leadville. Their home was small and simple, far from the elegant houses owned by wealthy mine investors who had begun to appear in the growing town. The Browns lived modestly, surrounded by neighbors who worked long hours and depended entirely on the unpredictable mining industry. James continued his work deep underground. Every day, he descended into the mines, traveling through dark tunnels carved into the mountains. The air below was thick with dust, the lighting dim, and the risks constant. Cave-ins, flooding, and explosions were dangers every miner accepted as part of the job. It was hard work that demanded both strength and courage. Margaret understood this reality well. She knew that every morning when James left for work, there was no guarantee he would return safely at the end of the day. But James never complained. Instead, he focused on improving his knowledge of mining. Over time, his supervisors began to notice something different about him. He didn't just follow instructions, he paid attention to the rock layers, the patterns in the mineral deposits, and the way certain areas of the mine behaved. While other miners focused only on their daily tasks, James quietly studied the ground around him. Margaret, meanwhile, was building her own place in the community. She had always been a strong-willed woman, and Leadville gave her a chance to express that strength. She became involved with local church groups and community activities, helping neighbors and supporting causes that mattered to the working families of the town. Her upbringing in poverty had given her a deep understanding of hardship. She often saw the struggles faced by miners' families, wives trying to stretch small incomes, children growing up in crowded homes, and workers risking their lives underground for wages that barely supported their households. Margaret refused to ignore these realities. Even though she and James were not wealthy, she believed strongly in helping others whenever possible. Her compassion and confidence began to earn her respect among many people in the community. Still, the Browns' life remained uncertain. Mining was unpredictable. A mine that seemed promising, one year could collapse financially the next. Fortunes could be made overnight, but they could just as easily vanish. Margaret and James knew that their future depended on forces far beyond their control. Yet neither of them suspected that a single discovery hidden deep inside the Leadville mines was about to change their lives forever. And when it happened, the quiet miner who studied the rocks more carefully than anyone else would suddenly become the man who found it. For years, James Joseph Brown had worked deep beneath the mountains surrounding Leadville, slowly gaining the respect of other miners and supervisors. His reputation was not built on strength alone, but on something far rarer in the mines: careful observation and patience. While many miners focused only on extracting as much ore as possible, James studied the earth itself. He watched how the rock layers formed, how the mineral veins twisted through the mountain, and how certain sections of the mine behaved differently from others. He believed the mountain still held secrets that many miners had overlooked. That belief would soon prove correct. In the early 1890s, James was working at the Ibex Mining Company, one of the many operations digging into the rich ore fields around Leadville. At the time, the mine was struggling. Water had begun flooding certain sections underground, making it difficult to reach the deeper areas where valuable ore might still exist. Most workers believed the flooded tunnels were a lost cause, but James saw the situation differently. Instead of abandoning the problem, he proposed a solution. By installing a special pump system, the company could drain the water and access the deeper parts of the mine. If his theory was correct, Those deeper layers might contain a rich deposit of gold and high-grade ore. It was a risky idea. Mining companies often hesitated to invest money in uncertain solutions, but James had built enough trust with the mine's leadership that they agreed to test his plan. The pumps were installed. Slowly, the water was drained from the flooded tunnels. Workers began exploring areas that had been unreachable for years. What they discovered shocked everyone. Deep inside the mine lay a rich vein of gold-bearing ore, far more valuable than anyone had expected. The discovery transformed the struggling mine into a highly profitable operation almost overnight, and suddenly, the man responsible for the idea was no longer just another miner. James Joseph Brown was promoted to a management position and awarded shares in the company. Those shares soon became extremely valuable as the mine began producing large amounts of gold. Almost overnight, the Browns' financial situation changed dramatically. The couple, who had once lived modestly among Leadville's working families, now found themselves among the wealthy residents of the booming mining town. But Margaret Brown had not forgotten where she came from. While money had entered their lives, the lessons of poverty and hardship still shaped the way she saw the world. And instead of allowing wealth to change her character, Margaret was about to use it in a way that few wealthy people ever did. The girl who once worked in a tobacco factory in Missouri was about to become one of the most remarkable women in America. The discovery inside the Leadville mine changed everything for Margaret and James Brown. Only a few years earlier, they had been living modestly in a small home, counting every dollar and hoping the dangerous work in the mines would someday bring stability. Now, almost overnight, their lives had taken an unexpected turn. James Joseph Brown was no longer just a miner. After the successful discovery of gold-bearing ore in the Ibex mine, he was promoted within the company and received shares in the operation. As the mine continued producing valuable ore, those shares grew rapidly in value. Suddenly, the Browns were wealthy, but wealth brought new choices and new expectations. Leadville had been the place where they built their early lives together, but it was still a rough mining town. For families who had gained wealth, there was another city that offered a more refined life. That city was Denver, Colorado. At the time, Denver was growing quickly into one of the most important cities in the American West. Elegant homes, new businesses, and expanding cultural institutions were transforming it into a center of wealth and influence. It was also where many successful mine owners and investors chose to live. In the 1890s, Margaret and James decided to move there, leaving behind the rough edges of Leadville for a more comfortable life in the city. They purchased a large Victorian house in Denver, a beautiful residence that reflected their new status. The home stood in one of the city's growing neighborhoods, surrounded by other families who had also made fortunes through mining and business. For many people, this would have been the moment to fully embrace the life of the wealthy elite. Fine clothing, lavish parties, and a comfortable distance from the struggles of working-class communities. But Margaret Brown was not interested in becoming just another socialite. Despite her new wealth, she still remembered the long days in the tobacco factory in Hannibal and the harsh conditions faced by miners' families in Leadville. Those memories had shaped her deeply. Instead of simply enjoying her fortune, Margaret began looking for ways to use her position to help others. She believed that wealth carried responsibility and that people who had been given opportunities should use them to improve the lives of those around them. Denver, with its growing population and social challenges, soon became the place where Margaret would begin proving that belief. And before long, the former miner's wife from Missouri would become known as something far more powerful than a wealthy woman. She would become a force for change. When Margaret Brown arrived in Denver, she entered a world very different from the rough mining town of Leadville. Denver's wealthy society had its own rules. Elegant dinners, charity balls, and carefully organized social circles filled the lives of the city's upper class. Wealthy families spent their evenings attending events, discussing business, and maintaining the image expected of people with status and influence. For many women in these circles, life followed a predictable pattern. They hosted gatherings, supported their husbands' business connections, and participated in polite, charitable work. Society expected them to be graceful, quiet, and obedient to tradition. But Margaret Brown had never been the kind of woman who simply followed expectations. Her upbringing had shaped her differently. She had grown up watching her father work exhausting hours just to support the family. She had spent her own youth working in factories and living among laborers who struggled daily to survive. Those experiences had given her a strong sense of justice. Once settled in Denver, Margaret quickly became involved in causes that many wealthy families preferred to ignore. She supported charities that helped poor families, immigrants, and workers who were struggling in the rapidly growing city. But she didn't stop there. Margaret also began speaking openly about issues that were controversial at the time, especially the rights of working people and the importance of education for women. During the late 19th century, women in America still had very limited rights. They could not vote in national elections, and many social institutions believed women should remain silent in political matters. Margaret strongly disagreed. She believed women deserved education, independence, and a voice in the future of their communities. In Denver, she became involved in organizations that supported women's education and social reform. One of the causes closest to her heart was helping the families of miners. Margaret had never forgotten the dangers faced by workers in the mines. Accidents were common, and when miners were injured or killed, their families were often left with little support. She used her growing influence to raise money and awareness for these families, helping ensure they were not forgotten by the prosperous society built on mining wealth. People in Denver soon realized that Margaret Brown was not interested in simply enjoying her fortune. She spoke confidently, acted boldly, and refused to remain silent when she believed something was wrong. Some admired her. Others found her outspoken personality shocking for a woman of her time. But one thing was becoming clear to everyone who met her. Margaret Brown was not just another wealthy resident of Denver. She was becoming a powerful voice in a society that was not used to hearing women speak so loudly. As the years passed, Margaret Brown became one of the most recognizable women in Denver's growing society. But unlike many wealthy residents who spent their time enjoying luxury, Margaret continued to push herself into places where few women of her status were willing to go. She believed strongly that wealth should not create distance from the struggles of ordinary people. Instead, it should be used to help solve them. One of the causes she became deeply involved in was education. Margaret believed that education could open doors for people the same way opportunity had changed her own life. She supported efforts to improve schools and libraries, especially for children from poor families who might otherwise have little access to learning. She also worked with organizations that helped immigrants settle into American life. Denver, like many cities at the time, was growing rapidly with newcomers from Europe and other parts of the world. Many of these immigrants arrived with little money, unfamiliar with the language and customs of their new country. Margaret understood their struggles. Her own parents had once been immigrants from Ireland, arriving in America with hope but very little security. Because of that background, she felt a personal responsibility to support people who were trying to build new lives in a foreign land. But Margaret's ambitions did not stop at charity. She was also deeply interested in politics and social reform. At a time when most women were expected to stay away from political discussions, Margaret openly supported the women's suffrage movement, the growing effort to give women the right to vote. Her involvement surprised many people. In elite social circles, outspoken political opinions, especially from women, were often seen as improper. Some members of Denver society quietly criticized Margaret for being too bold, too opinionated, and too willing to challenge traditional roles. Margaret didn't seem to care. She continued attending meetings, supporting reform movements, and speaking confidently about issues that mattered to her. Over time, she built a reputation not only as a wealthy woman, but also as a determined advocate for change. Her energy seemed endless. She studied languages, traveled widely, and surrounded herself with artists, thinkers, and activists who shared her interest in improving society. Yet while Margaret's influence in Denver continued to grow, Her personal life was becoming more complicated. Her husband, James Brown, preferred a quieter life focused on business. He was proud of Margaret's intelligence and determination, but their interests were slowly beginning to move in different directions. The marriage that had once united two people from humble beginnings was starting to feel the pressure of their very different ambitions. And although they would remain respectful toward one another, the path their lives would take from this point forward was about to change in ways neither of them had expected. By the turn of the 20th century, Margaret Brown had become a well-known figure in Denver. Her energy, intelligence, and strong personality had made her stand out in a society that often expected women to remain quiet and reserved. But while Margaret's public life continued to grow, her private life was beginning to shift. Her husband, James Joseph Brown, had always been a hard-working and practical man. His success in the mining industry had brought the family wealth, and he was proud of the life they had built together. Yet James preferred stability and privacy, focusing on business and the financial responsibilities that came with their fortune. Margaret, however, had become increasingly drawn to a different world. She was fascinated by politics, education, travel, and social reform. She attended meetings, supported charitable organizations, and surrounded herself with people who were interested in changing society. The difference between their personalities slowly began to create distance between them. James was not opposed to Margaret's activities, but he did not share the same enthusiasm for public life. While Margaret enjoyed discussions about politics and international affairs, James preferred the practical world of business and industry. Over time, their lives began to move in separate directions. Despite the growing distance, the Browns never allowed their relationship to turn bitter. They had built their lives together during difficult times in Leadville, and that shared history created a deep respect between them. Instead of pursuing a traditional divorce, which was often scandalous during that era, they chose a different path. Margaret and James agreed to live separate lives while remaining legally married. This arrangement allowed both of them the freedom to pursue their own interests without destroying the family's reputation. James continued focusing on business, while Margaret began spending more time traveling and expanding her social and political connections. Their decision was unusual for the time, but it reflected the unique nature of their relationship. They had married for love during years of struggle, and although their lives had changed, that respect never disappeared. For Margaret, this new independence opened the door to experiences far beyond Denver. With financial freedom and a growing curiosity about the world, she began traveling extensively, visiting major cities across the United States, and eventually crossing the Atlantic to explore Europe. These journeys would introduce her to new cultures, new ideas, and new friendships, but they would also place her in a position where fate would soon lead her toward one of the most famous moments in history. A moment that would forever link Margaret Brown's name to a single ship. A ship the world would never forget. With her marriage quietly shifting into a more distant partnership, Margaret Brown found herself with something she had never truly possessed before: complete freedom to explore the world, and she intended to use it. By the early 1900s, travel had become one of Margaret's greatest passions. Unlike the young girl who once watched steamboats from the banks of the Mississippi River in Hannibal, she was now able to journey across continents. She traveled frequently between the United States and Europe, visiting some of the most famous cities of the era. In Paris, she explored art galleries and attended cultural events that introduced her to painters, writers, and intellectuals. In London, she observed the political discussions shaping the future of the British Empire. In Rome and Florence, she walked through ancient streets filled with history far older than the young country she had grown up in. Margaret approached travel with the curiosity of a student. She believed that learning about different cultures and ideas could help her better understand the world. During these trips, she studied languages, attended lectures, and immersed herself in conversations about politics, science, and social reform. This was unusual behavior for many wealthy American tourists of the time. While some traveled simply for leisure, Margaret treated every journey as an opportunity to expand her knowledge. She admired European culture but also studied the political movements developing across the continent. The early 20th century was a time of dramatic change. New technologies were transforming transportation and communication. Political movements were challenging traditional power structures. Across Europe and America, activists were demanding expanded rights for workers and women. Margaret followed these developments closely. Her support for women's suffrage continued to grow stronger. She believed women should not only vote, but also participate directly in shaping the future of their societies. Back in the United States, she even made an ambitious attempt to enter politics herself. Margaret considered running for a seat in Congress, an extraordinary idea at a time when women still lacked the right to vote nationally. Although the campaign never fully materialized, the very attempt showed how determined she had become to challenge the limits placed on women. Friends often described her as fearless. She spoke confidently in discussions dominated by powerful men, and she refused to accept the idea that women should remain silent observers of history. But despite her growing reputation as a traveler, activist, and outspoken reformer, Margaret's life was about to be shaped by an event she could never have predicted. In 1912, while traveling in Europe, she received news that would abruptly end her journey. A member of her family back in America had fallen seriously ill. Without hesitation, Margaret prepared to return home. She hurriedly booked passage on a ship that was about to make its first voyage across the Atlantic. At the time, it was being called the most magnificent ship ever built. Its name was Titanic. In the spring of 1912, Margaret Brown was traveling in Europe, enjoying the cultural life she had grown to love. Cities like Paris had become familiar to her, filled with museums, theaters, and conversations with people from around the world. But her journey was suddenly interrupted. Margaret received troubling news from home. A member of her family in the United States had fallen seriously ill, and the message made it clear that she needed to return as quickly as possible. Without hesitation, she began making arrangements for the long journey across the Atlantic. In those days, crossing the ocean required patience. The voyage between Europe and America could take nearly a week by ship. Wealthy travelers often chose the most comfortable vessels available, ships that promised luxury and safety while transporting passengers between the two continents. At that moment, one ship in particular was attracting attention across the world. It was the newest vessel of the White Star Line, a massive ocean liner that newspapers were calling the greatest ship ever built, the Titanic. The ship was designed to be a marvel of modern engineering. Stretching more than 880 feet in length and weighing over 46,000 tons, Titanic was larger and more luxurious than almost any passenger ship that had come before it. Everything about the vessel was meant to impress. First-class passengers could enjoy grand staircases, elegant dining rooms, luxurious cabins, and even swimming pools and libraries. The ship was built to reflect the confidence of the early 20th century, a time when people believed technology could conquer nearly any challenge. Some even claimed the ship was unsinkable. Margaret secured a first-class ticket for the voyage back to America. For someone of her social standing, the accommodations would have been comfortable, surrounded by wealthy travelers, businessmen, and prominent figures crossing the Atlantic. But for Margaret, the trip was not meant to be an adventure. It was simply a journey home. She boarded the ship in Cherbourg, France, joining hundreds of passengers who were stepping aboard the massive liner during its maiden voyage. The atmosphere on the docks was filled with excitement. Crowds gathered to watch the enormous ship prepare for departure, marveling at its size and elegance. To many people, Titanic represented the triumph of modern civilization. No one standing on that dock could have imagined that the ship would soon become the center of one of the most tragic disasters in maritime history. Margaret certainly did not. Like the other passengers boarding that day, she believed she was stepping onto one of the safest ships ever built. But far out in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, something unseen was already waiting. And within days, the voyage that began with such confidence would turn into a desperate fight for survival. When Margaret Brown stepped aboard the Titanic, she entered a world unlike any ship that had ever crossed the Atlantic before. From the outside, the vessel already seemed enormous. Towering above the docks, its 4 massive funnels and long black hull made it look more like a floating city than a passenger ship. Workers, passengers, and crew moved constantly along the decks as the ship prepared for its historic maiden voyage. But the true spectacle lay inside. Titanic had been designed to rival the finest hotels in Europe. For first-class passengers like Margaret, the ship offered a level of comfort that most people had never imagined could exist at sea. Grand staircases curved upward through several decks, illuminated by an enormous glass dome that allowed sunlight to pour into the interior. Polished wood, ornate iron railings, and luxurious carpets decorated the corridors. Everything about the ship was meant to signal wealth, elegance, and modern progress. First-class passengers could enjoy an extraordinary range of amenities. There were elegant dining rooms where elaborate meals were served on fine china. There were reading rooms, smoking lounges, and private promenades where guests could stroll while watching the endless Atlantic horizon. The ship even featured a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and Turkish baths, luxuries rarely seen even in the finest hotels of the time. For wealthy travelers, the journey itself was meant to be an experience. Margaret moved among other prominent passengers during the voyage. Business leaders, wealthy families, and international travelers filled the upper decks. Conversations at dinner tables ranged from politics and finance to the excitement surrounding the new century and the technological achievements that seemed to be transforming the world. Titanic symbolized that confidence. The early 20th century was an era when many people believed humanity had entered a new age of progress. Railroads connected continents, electricity, illuminated cities, and giant ships like Titanic demonstrated the incredible power of modern engineering. Some newspapers had even begun describing the vessel as unsinkable. Whether or not the ship's builders had actually made that claim, the idea spread quickly among the public. Titanic's advanced safety features, including watertight compartments designed to seal off flooding sections of the ship, seemed to make disaster almost impossible. Passengers walked the decks with complete confidence. Margaret, like many others aboard, had no reason to feel concerned. The voyage had begun smoothly, and the ship was performing exactly as expected, gliding steadily across the vast Atlantic Ocean toward New York. But while the passengers enjoyed music, conversation, and fine meals, the Titanic was moving steadily into colder waters. And somewhere ahead of them, hidden in the darkness of the North Atlantic, a silent threat was drifting slowly through the sea. For the first several days of the voyage, life aboard the Titanic unfolded exactly as its designers had intended. Passengers settled comfortably into the rhythm of the journey. Days were filled with elegant meals, casual conversations, and leisurely walks along the wide decks, overlooking the endless Atlantic Ocean. The ship moved smoothly through the water, its massive engines quietly pushing the great vessel toward New York. For many travelers, the trip felt less like a crossing of the ocean and more like a stay at a luxurious floating hotel. First-class passengers gathered each evening in the grand dining room, where multi-course dinners were served under glittering chandeliers. Men in formal suits discussed business and politics, while orchestras played softly in nearby lounges. Women in elegant gowns strolled along the promenade decks, enjoying the crisp sea air and the quiet beauty of the open water. Margaret Brown moved easily within this environment. Although she had not been born into wealth, years of travel and social experience had made her comfortable among society's elite. She spoke confidently with fellow passengers and often joined conversations about politics, world affairs, and social reform. Some of the passengers she encountered during those days would later become well known in the tragic story of the Titanic. Among them were some of the richest individuals in America and Europe, industrialists, financiers, and prominent families traveling in extraordinary luxury. To many observers, the ship itself seemed to symbolize the confidence of this powerful social class. Below the upper decks, however, life looked very different. The Titanic carried more than 2,200 passengers and crew, including hundreds of immigrants traveling in third class. These passengers had far simpler accommodations, but for many of them, the journey still represented hope. They were crossing the Atlantic in search of new lives in America. In the evenings, music drifted up from the lower decks, where families gathered to sing and dance in crowded common rooms. Children played in narrow corridors while parents dreamed about the opportunities waiting in the United States. Despite the differences between the ship's classes, most passengers shared the same belief. They were traveling on the safest ship ever built. The weather during the voyage remained calm, the ocean was unusually smooth, and the skies were clear. By the evening of the 14th of April 1912, the Titanic had already traveled most of the distance between Europe and America. Passengers expected to arrive in New York within just a few days. But that evening, messages began arriving in the ship's wireless room. Other vessels in the North Atlantic were sending warnings. They had encountered icebergs drifting in the shipping lanes ahead. At first, these warnings seemed routine. Ice in the northern Atlantic was not unusual during spring voyages. The Titanic's officers noted the messages, but the ship continued moving steadily through the cold, dark waters of the night. Far above the ocean, the stars shone brightly. The sea was calm and silent, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, a massive iceberg waited nearly invisible against the black water. On the evening of the 14th of April 1912, the Titanic continued its steady journey across the North Atlantic. Dinner had ended hours earlier, and many passengers were enjoying the calm final hours of the day. Some gathered in the ship's elegant lounges, listening to music or sharing drinks and conversation. Others had already returned to their cabins, preparing for a quiet night of sleep. The ocean outside was unusually calm. There were no large waves breaking against the hull, and the surface of the water looked almost like dark glass, stretching endlessly beneath the starlit sky. It was a beautiful night, but also a dangerous one. Without waves crashing against them, icebergs were harder to spot. High above the deck, 2 crew members stood in the ship's crow's nest, the lookout station positioned at the front of the vessel. Their job was simple but crucial. Watch the dark horizon for anything that might threaten the ship. For most of the evening, the horizon had been empty. Then, at 11:40 p.m., one of the lookouts suddenly noticed something directly ahead. At first, it appeared as a dark shape rising slowly out of the black water. Within seconds, he realized what it was: an iceberg. The lookout immediately rang the warning bell and telephoned the bridge. The message was urgent and terrifyingly simple. Iceberg, right ahead. On the bridge, the ship's officers reacted quickly. Orders were shouted to the engine room and the steering crew. The massive vessel began turning in an attempt to avoid the ice. But Titanic was enormous, and it was moving fast. Despite the quick reaction, there was not enough distance. Moments later, passengers across the ship felt a strange sensation, more like a long, scraping vibration than a violent crash. Many people barely noticed it at all. In their cabins and lounges, some passengers paused briefly, wondering what had happened. Then the ship continued moving forward. To most people on board, it seemed like a minor incident. But deep beneath the surface of the ocean, the iceberg had already done its damage. As Titanic brushed along the side of the massive ice formation, jagged edges of ice tore open several sections of the ship's hull. Seawater immediately began rushing into the lower compartments. At first, the damage was hidden from nearly everyone on board. But the ship's engineers and officers were already beginning to understand something terrifying. The Titanic had been built with watertight compartments designed to keep it afloat even if part of the hull was damaged. But the iceberg had opened too many sections. Slowly but inevitably, water began filling the ship. And within minutes, the people responsible for the Titanic's safety realized the unthinkable truth. The greatest ship in the world was going to sink. At first, most passengers aboard the Titanic believed the strange vibration they had felt was nothing serious. Some people barely noticed it at all. In the elegant lounges and corridors of the first-class decks, conversations continued as usual. A few curious passengers stepped outside to the promenade decks, looking around the dark ocean to see if anything unusual had happened. From the outside, the ship looked perfectly normal. The engines had stopped, but there was no loud explosion, no violent crash, and no obvious sign of danger. Many passengers assumed the ship had simply slowed down for safety after encountering ice. But deep inside the Titanic, the situation was already becoming critical. Below the waterline, engineers rushed through narrow corridors as icy seawater poured into the damaged compartments. The iceberg had sliced open several sections of the hull along the starboard side of the ship. Water was flooding in faster than the pumps could remove it. Captain Edward Smith was quickly summoned to the bridge, where he met with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who had been traveling on the maiden voyage. Andrews understood the ship's structure better than anyone. After examining the damage reports, he made a calculation that chilled everyone in the room. The Titanic could remain afloat with 4 flooded compartments, but the iceberg had opened 5. Water was already spilling from one compartment into the next, slowly pulling the massive ship lower into the sea. There was no realistic way to stop it. Andrews delivered the devastating conclusion: the ship would sink. At best, they might have 2 hours before the Titanic disappeared beneath the ocean. For a moment, the bridge fell silent. The largest and most advanced ship ever built, considered by many to be practically unsinkable, was now doomed in the middle of the freezing Atlantic Ocean. Captain Smith knew what had to happen next. The order was given to begin preparing the lifeboats. Crew members moved quickly across the decks, waking passengers and instructing them to put on life jackets. At first, the announcements were calm and careful. Officers did not want to cause panic. Many passengers were told the lifeboats were simply a precaution. Margaret Brown, like many others, soon became aware that something unusual was happening. Crew members were moving quickly along the corridors, knocking on cabin doors and urging passengers to come to the upper decks. Outside, the cold night air bit sharply against the skin. Above them, the stars shone brightly over the dark ocean. Passengers began gathering near the lifeboats, confused but still largely calm. Some laughed nervously, believing the situation could not possibly be serious. After all, this was the Titanic, the ship everyone believed could never sink. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the massive vessel was beginning to tilt forward, and before long, the calm atmosphere on deck would begin to disappear. As the reality of the situation slowly spread across the decks of the Titanic, the atmosphere began to change. At first, many passengers treated the situation as little more than an inconvenience. Some stepped out onto the cold decks wearing heavy coats over their evening clothes, curious to see what was happening. Others laughed nervously, joking about the unusual midnight gathering. Crew members moved quickly between the lifeboats, preparing them for launch. The ship had 20 lifeboats, far fewer than the number of people on board. Even if every boat were filled to capacity, they could carry only about half of the passengers and crew. But at that moment, very few people understood the seriousness of the situation. Officers began enforcing the rule that had long been part of maritime tradition: women and children first. Men were instructed to step back while families were guided toward the lifeboats. Some passengers protested, insisting they did not want to leave the safety of the enormous ship for a small wooden boat in the middle of the dark ocean. The Titanic still appeared strong and stable. Many people believed it would remain afloat long enough for rescue ships to arrive. As a result, some of the earliest lifeboats were lowered half-empty. Margaret Brown quickly realized that something far more serious was unfolding. Years of facing difficult situations had taught her to recognize when calm instructions were hiding real danger. She helped encourage nervous passengers to move toward the lifeboats, speaking firmly to those who hesitated. Across the deck, confusion was spreading. Families were being separated as husbands helped their wives and children climb into the boats. Some men attempted to sneak aboard, hoping to stay with their loved ones, while officers struggled to maintain order. Meanwhile, the temperature continued to drop. The North Atlantic air was freezing, and the dark ocean surrounding the ship seemed endless and unforgiving. In the distance, crew members began firing distress rockets into the sky. Bright flashes of light exploded above the ship, briefly illuminating the towering decks before fading into darkness again. These signals were meant to alert any nearby vessels that the Titanic needed help. But in the vast Atlantic, help was still far away. As the lifeboat slowly descended toward the black water below, the angle of the ship was becoming more noticeable. Passengers began to feel the deck tilting slightly beneath their feet. Whispers of fear spread through the crowd. For the first time, people began asking a terrifying question: was the Titanic really going to sink? Margaret Brown soon found herself standing near lifeboat number 6. Officers were urging women to step forward and board quickly. She hesitated for a moment, looking back at the massive ship towering behind her. Then the order came. It was time to get into the boat. And once she stepped inside, Margaret Brown would find herself facing a new kind of danger, one that would test her courage in ways no one aboard the Titanic could yet imagine. As the chaos on the Titanic's decks continued to grow, Margaret Brown found herself standing beside one of the lifeboats, suspended high above the dark Atlantic. It was lifeboat number 6. Crew members were shouting instructions as women were helped over the railings and lowered into the small wooden boat. The cold night wind cut sharply across the deck, and the atmosphere was changing quickly. The earlier calm was disappearing, replaced by urgency and fear. Margaret hesitated. From where she stood, she could still see the enormous shape of the Titanic stretching into the darkness. The brightly lit decks made the ship appear strong and secure, and part of her instinct told her it was safer to remain aboard the giant liner than to climb into a small lifeboat in the middle of the freezing ocean. But the officers were firm. "Women first," they repeated. Margaret eventually stepped forward and climbed carefully into the lifeboat. Around her were other women wrapped in heavy coats, many of them frightened and confused about what was happening. One of the most important figures in the boat was Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, the crewman assigned to take control of lifeboat number 6 after it was lowered into the water. Once enough passengers had boarded, the crew released the ropes. Slowly, the lifeboat began descending toward the ocean. From inside the small boat, the Titanic looked even more enormous than before. Passengers watched silently as the ship's towering decks rose high above them while they were lowered down the side of the hull. Far below, the Atlantic waited in total darkness. When the lifeboat finally touched the water, the cold shock of the moment hit everyone at once. The ocean was black, quiet, and terrifyingly vast. Above them, the Titanic still shone brightly with electric lights, looking almost unreal against the star-filled sky. From a distance, it was difficult to believe the ship was actually sinking, but as the minutes passed, the truth became harder to ignore. From their position in the lifeboat, passengers could see the massive vessel beginning to tilt forward more clearly. The bow of the ship was slowly dipping lower into the water. On deck, more lifeboats were being lowered. The sounds of shouting voices and distant commands echoed across the cold air. Inside lifeboat, no, 6. Another problem was beginning to emerge. Some of the passengers wanted to row back toward the ship to rescue more people once the lifeboats had launched, but Robert Hitchens strongly disagreed. He feared that if the small boat returned too close to the Titanic, it might be pulled down by the powerful suction when the ship finally sank. The disagreement created tension among the passengers. Margaret Brown, never someone who stayed silent during a crisis, soon found herself at the center of the argument. And in the dark waters of the Atlantic, far from the safety of the ship, her leadership would soon begin to emerge in a way that no one aboard the Titanic would ever forget. Drifting in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, lifeboat No. 6 rocked gently on the dark waves. Above them, the Titanic still towered over the ocean like a floating city. Its rows of lights glowed brightly in the cold night, creating an almost surreal contrast with the silent, endless darkness of the sea. Inside the small lifeboat, fear was beginning to spread. Most of the passengers were women, many of them wrapped tightly in coats and blankets against the freezing wind. Some were crying softly, while others sat in stunned silence, unable to fully understand the scale of what was happening. Then, from the direction of the ship, new sounds began to echo across the water: shouting, distant voices, and the sharp cracks of lifeboats being lowered from the towering decks. Everyone in the lifeboat turned to watch. From their position on the ocean, they could now clearly see the Titanic's bow dipping lower into the water. The massive ship that had once seemed so powerful was slowly losing its battle against the sea. For the first time, the passengers in Lifeboat No. 6 began to realize the terrifying truth. Thousands of people were still aboard, and there were not enough lifeboats for all of them. The tension inside the boat quickly grew worse when Quartermaster Robert Hichens, the man responsible for steering the lifeboat, refused to allow anyone to row back toward the ship. Several passengers suggested they should return to pick up people struggling in the water once the Titanic went down, but Hichens strongly opposed the idea. He warned that if they returned too close, the sinking ship could pull their small lifeboat under with it. The powerful suction created by the massive vessel disappearing beneath the ocean could easily drag them all to their deaths. His words filled the boat with dread, but Margaret Brown was not willing to accept inaction. She had always been known for her strong personality, and even in the middle of this terrifying night, she refused to sit quietly while others argued about what to do. Margaret began encouraging the women in the boat to take the oars and start rowing. The cold wind was biting through their clothing, and remaining still would only make the freezing temperatures more dangerous. If they kept moving, they might stay warm, and if they worked together, they might still be able to help others. Hichens resisted the idea at first, insisting that rowing was unnecessary and that they should simply drift away from the sinking ship. But Margaret challenged him directly. Her voice cut through the tension inside the lifeboat as she urged the others to act rather than surrender to fear. One by one, the women began taking the oars, and in that small wooden boat floating in the darkness, Margaret Brown's determination began transforming panic into action. Far behind them, the Titanic was sinking deeper into the freezing Atlantic, and within minutes, the night would explode with sounds that none of them would ever forget. From the dark waters surrounding the Titanic, the passengers in Lifeboat No. 6 watched a sight that seemed impossible. The massive ship was slowly sinking. At first, the movement was subtle. The bow of the vessel dipped lower and lower into the ocean, while the stern rose slightly higher above the water. The once perfectly level decks were now tilted at an angle that could no longer be ignored. Inside the lifeboat, everyone stared in stunned silence. The bright electric lights of the Titanic still illuminated the decks, making the disaster appear strangely unreal. From a distance, the ship looked like a glowing city slowly sinking into the sea. Then the sounds began. Voices, hundreds of them. Passengers on the ship were now fully aware of the danger. People were shouting instructions, calling for loved ones, and rushing toward the remaining lifeboats. The once orderly evacuation was turning into chaos. From where they floated in the darkness, Margaret Brown and the others could hear the growing panic. Lifeboats were still being lowered, but there were not enough. Every minute that passed meant the ship was sinking deeper, leaving less time for those still trapped on board. Suddenly, a deep metallic groan echoed across the ocean. The sound came from the Titanic itself. The enormous steel structure was under tremendous stress as the bow filled with water and the stern continued to rise higher into the air. The ship's lights flickered against the night sky while the sounds of breaking metal carried across the water inside Lifeboat No. 6. Several passengers covered their ears. They knew what they were witnessing, the final moments of the largest ship ever built. Then, sometime after 2 a.m., the inevitable happened. The Titanic broke apart. The enormous vessel split into 2 sections, sending a thunderous roar across the freezing Atlantic. The bow disappeared beneath the water first, dragging the front half of the ship into the depths. Moments later, the stern lifted almost vertically into the air before slipping beneath the surface as well. Within minutes, the lights vanished. The great ship was gone. For a brief moment, the ocean became eerily silent. Then the silence shattered. From the darkness came the desperate cries of hundreds of people struggling in the freezing water. The sound was horrifying. Men, women, and children were calling for help as the icy Atlantic closed around them. The temperature of the water was so cold that survival would last only minutes. Inside the lifeboat, the passengers listened in shock and disbelief. Some began to cry. Others begged to row back and rescue those still alive in the water. But fear still held the boat in place, because everyone knew one terrible truth. If they returned too soon, their small lifeboat might be overwhelmed by the desperate crowd fighting for survival in the dark sea. In the darkness of the North Atlantic, the passengers in Lifeboat No. 6 sat frozen not only from the cold, but from the terrifying sounds echoing across the water. The cries for help were everywhere. From every direction came the voices of men and women struggling in the freezing ocean. Some were shouting for lifeboats, others were calling the names of loved ones who had disappeared in the chaos. The sound was almost unbearable. Many of the women in the lifeboat began sobbing quietly. A few covered their ears, unable to listen to the desperate pleas drifting through the night. But doing nothing was just as painful. Several passengers begged Quartermaster Robert Hitchens to turn the boat around. If they rowed back quickly, they might still be able to save someone. Hitchens refused. His voice was firm and tense as he explained his fear. If they returned to the area where the ship had gone down, dozens, perhaps hundreds of desperate people might attempt to climb into the small lifeboat. The boat could easily be overturned, and if that happened, everyone in it would die. The argument inside the lifeboat grew heated. Some passengers agreed with Hitchens, believing it was too dangerous to return. Others felt the moral weight of the situation pressing heavily on them. They could hear people dying in the water. Margaret Brown was among those who refused to accept the idea of abandoning them. She stood up in the boat, her voice strong despite the cold wind whipping across the ocean. Margaret argued that they should at least try to help someone, anyone who might still be alive. She encouraged the women around her to keep rowing and to remain alert in case survivors drifted near their boat. Her determination began changing the atmosphere inside the lifeboat. Instead of sitting helplessly in fear, the women began focusing on the task in front of them, rowing through the freezing night and searching the dark water around them. Margaret also pushed the group to keep moving for another reason. The temperature was dropping dangerously low. Remaining still in the lifeboat meant the cold would slowly drain their strength. By rowing, they could keep their bodies warm enough to survive the long night ahead. Gradually, the lifeboat moved farther from the area where the Titanic had disappeared. Behind them, the desperate cries in the water began to fade. One by one, the voices grew weaker, until eventually the ocean fell silent again. That silence was perhaps the most haunting moment of all. More than 1,500 people had been lost in the freezing Atlantic. And now the survivors in the lifeboats were alone on the dark ocean, waiting for rescue that might not arrive until morning. But Margaret Brown refused to let despair take control. Even in the darkness, she continued urging the others to stay strong. Because somewhere beyond the black horizon, help was finally on its way. After the Titanic disappeared beneath the ocean, a heavy silence settled over the North Atlantic. The survivors drifting in lifeboats were left alone in the darkness. Inside Lifeboat Number 6, the women sat tightly together, their breath visible in the freezing night air. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the cold wind swept across the open water without mercy. Many of them were trembling uncontrollably. The shock of the disaster, combined with the bitter cold, made the long hours feel endless. For a while, no one spoke. The terrifying cries that had filled the night only minutes earlier had slowly faded away. The people who had been struggling in the freezing water were now gone, and the ocean had returned to a haunting silence. Above them, the sky was still filled with stars. But the beauty of the night felt cruel now. The survivors knew that somewhere beneath the dark water lay the remains of the greatest ship ever built and the hundreds of lives that had been lost with it. Inside the lifeboat, Margaret Brown continued to push the group forward. She understood that the greatest enemy now was not panic, but the cold. If the passengers allowed themselves to sit still for too long, the freezing temperatures could quickly weaken them. So she encouraged the women to keep rowing. Even small movements could help their bodies stay warm. Margaret spoke calmly but firmly, urging everyone to remain alert and active through the long night. Some of the passengers later recalled how her determination helped them stay focused. Instead of giving in to despair, Margaret kept reminding them that rescue ships would eventually arrive. The Titanic had sent distress signals before sinking, and other vessels in the Atlantic would almost certainly be responding. The challenge was surviving long enough for help to reach them. In the distance, faint lights from other lifeboats could occasionally be seen rising and falling with the waves. Dozens of small boats were scattered across the dark ocean, each filled with frightened survivors waiting for morning. Time seemed to move painfully slowly. The cold air cut through their clothing, and exhaustion began to weigh heavily on everyone in the boat. Some passengers drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, their bodies weakened by fear and shock. Then, after what felt like an endless night, the first faint glow appeared on the horizon. Dawn was finally coming. And with the rising light came the first real hope that someone might find them in the vast Atlantic Ocean. As the first light of dawn slowly spread across the Atlantic, the survivors in the lifeboats finally began to see the full reality of the disaster. The ocean around them was scattered with small wooden boats. Dozens of lifeboats floated across the vast gray water, each carrying passengers who had escaped the sinking of the Titanic. The night that had hidden the scale of the tragedy was now lifting, revealing exhausted faces, soaked clothing, and people struggling to stay warm after hours in the freezing air. Inside Lifeboat No. 6, the passengers stared silently at the empty horizon. Where the Titanic had once stood, there was now nothing but open sea. For many of them, the sight was difficult to accept. Only hours earlier, they had been aboard the most magnificent ship in the world. Now they were drifting in a small lifeboat, surrounded by survivors who had lost friends, family members, and everything they had brought with them. The cold morning wind continued to sweep across the ocean. Some passengers were weak from the long night, their bodies stiff from cold and exhaustion. Others scanned the horizon desperately, searching for any sign that rescue might be coming. Then someone shouted. Far in the distance, a thin column of smoke could be seen rising above the water. At first, it was only a faint dark line against the pale morning sky, but as the minutes passed, the shape became clearer. It was the smoke from a ship's funnel, a rescue ship. The vessel was the Carpathia, a passenger liner that had received the Titanic's distress signals during the night. Its captain had immediately turned the ship toward the disaster, pushing the engines to their limits as it raced through the dark Atlantic toward the last known position of the sinking liner. For hours, the Carpathia had steamed through icy waters filled with floating icebergs. Now, as the sun rose higher, the ship finally began reaching the scattered lifeboats. From the survivors' perspective, the sight was overwhelming. After hours of fear, cold, and uncertainty, help had finally arrived. Passengers in the lifeboats began waving their arms, shouting, and raising anything they could to attract attention. Some stood up in their boats despite the danger, desperate to make sure the approaching ship could see them. Inside Lifeboat No. 6, Margaret Brown and the others watched as the Carpathia slowly grew larger on the horizon. Relief swept through the boat, but even as rescue approached, the survivors knew something else as well. Their lives had been saved, but the world they had known only the night before had vanished forever beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. As the rescue ship grew larger on the horizon, hope spread through the lifeboats scattered across the Atlantic. The ship approaching them was the Carpathia, a passenger liner that had rushed through the night after receiving the Titanic's distress calls. Its captain had ordered the engines to run at full speed, pushing the vessel through dangerous waters filled with drifting ice. Now, at dawn, the Carpathia had finally arrived. From the deck of the rescue ship, crew members began scanning the ocean and spotting the lifeboats one by one. The survivors waved their arms and shouted desperately, trying to catch the attention of the sailors above. Soon, ropes and ladders were lowered down the side of the ship. The first lifeboats were carefully pulled alongside, and the exhausted passengers were helped aboard. Inside Lifeboat No. 6, the women watched as the Carpathia slowly approached their position. After hours drifting in the freezing ocean, the large ship now looked like a miracle rising out of the morning mist. When the Carpathia finally reached them, crew members began assisting the passengers one at a time. Many of the survivors were too weak to climb the rope ladders on their own. Sailors leaned over the railings, lifting them up with strong arms and pulling them safely onto the deck. When Margaret Brown stepped aboard the Carpathia, the long nightmare of the night had finally ended. But the shock of the disaster had only begun to settle in. Around her were hundreds of other survivors, wrapped in blankets provided by the ship's crew. Some were crying openly. Others sat quietly, staring at the ocean as if still trying to understand what had happened. The crew of the Carpathia did everything they could to help. Hot drinks were served, blankets were distributed. Doctors moved among the passengers, checking for injuries and treating those who had suffered from the cold. But nothing could erase the emotional shock of the tragedy. More than 1,507 people had died when the Titanic sank. Friends, husbands, wives, and children had been lost in the freezing water during the night. Even in the middle of that grief, Margaret Brown once again refused to remain passive. Instead of focusing only on her own survival, she quickly began helping others. She moved through the ship speaking with passengers, offering comfort to those who had lost loved ones. Soon she would begin organizing efforts to raise money for the survivors who had lost everything in the disaster. The night in the lifeboat had revealed something that people would soon recognize across the world. Margaret Brown was not just a survivor, she was becoming a symbol of courage. As the Carpathia continued its journey toward New York, the ship carried more than 700 survivors of the Titanic disaster. Every corner of the vessel was filled with people who had endured one of the most shocking maritime tragedies in history. Passengers wrapped in blankets filled the lounges, corridors, and dining areas. Some sat quietly, still processing the horror of the previous night. Others wept openly for the loved ones they had lost. The emotional weight aboard the ship was overwhelming. Many survivors had escaped with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Their luggage, their money, and all of their personal belongings had gone down with the Titanic. For the immigrants traveling in third class, the loss was even more devastating. Everything they owned, everything they had hoped to bring to their new lives in America, was now resting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. In the middle of this grief and confusion, Margaret Brown began taking action. Her natural leadership quickly became clear. While many passengers were still in shock, Margaret moved through the Carpathia, speaking with survivors and gathering information about who needed help the most. She listened to stories from frightened families, comforted those who had lost relatives, and tried to bring a sense of organization to the chaos surrounding them. Soon she realized that many of the survivors, particularly the poorer passengers, would arrive in New York with absolutely nothing. They would need money, clothing, and assistance to begin rebuilding their lives. Margaret decided to do something about it immediately. She began organizing what would become the Titanic Survivors Committee, working with other first-class passengers who had influence and financial resources. Together, they began raising funds on board the Carpathia while the ship was still at sea. Margaret moved from passenger to passenger, encouraging donations and explaining the urgent needs of those who had lost everything. Her determination was remarkable. In only a short time, the group managed to collect thousands of dollars to support the survivors waiting to arrive in New York. For Margaret, this effort was not about recognition. It was simply the natural response of someone who believed that people should help each other in moments of crisis. The tragedy of the Titanic had revealed the worst dangers of human vulnerability, but it had also revealed the strength and compassion that could emerge in times of disaster. and Margaret Brown had become one of the clearest examples of that spirit. But when the Carpathia finally reached New York, Margaret had no idea that her actions during the disaster were about to make her famous across the world. As the Carpathia approached New York Harbor on the 18th of April 1912, thousands of people were already waiting along the docks. News of the Titanic disaster had spread rapidly across the world. Newspapers had been publishing updates for days, and families desperately searched for information about relatives who had been on board the doomed ship. Crowds gathered in the cold rain near the harbor, hoping to see the survivors arrive. When the Carpathia finally sailed into port, the atmosphere was tense and emotional. Reporters, photographers, and anxious families filled the docks, watching the ship slowly come to a stop. For many people, the moment was bittersweet. Some survivors would soon be reunited with loved ones waiting on shore. Others would step off the ship carrying devastating news. As passengers began disembarking, journalists rushed forward to gather stories about the sinking of the Titanic. The public wanted to know what had happened on the night the great ship disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Among the many survivors stepping onto the dock was Margaret Brown. But unlike most passengers, Margaret did not immediately leave the scene. Instead, she continued working to help those who had suffered the most from the disaster. The funds she had helped organize aboard the Carpathia were already being distributed to survivors who had lost everything. Many of the immigrants who had traveled in third class arrived in New York with no money, no clothing beyond what they were wearing, and no clear plan for how to continue their journey. Margaret made sure they were not forgotten. Her actions quickly caught the attention of reporters covering the story. Journalists began writing about the strong, determined woman who had not only survived the sinking, but had also taken charge in helping other passengers during the aftermath. Stories about her bravery began appearing in newspapers across the United States. People were fascinated by her behavior during the disaster. Her arguments in the lifeboat, her encouragement to keep rowing through the freezing night, and her efforts to organize aid for other survivors. Soon, reporters began referring to her with a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life. They called her the unsinkable Mrs. Brown. The name captured the spirit people saw in her, a woman who refused to surrender to fear or despair, even during one of the most terrifying nights in maritime history. Margaret Brown never asked for that title, but from that moment forward, it would become part of her legacy. And the story of the Titanic would ensure that the world would never forget her name. After the Titanic disaster, Margaret Brown's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. The tragedy had shocked the world, and newspapers across America and Europe continued publishing stories about the survivors for months. Among those stories, Margaret's name appeared again and again. People were fascinated by the woman who had shown such courage during the disaster. The nickname, the unsinkable Mrs. Brown, quickly became famous. It captured the image of a determined survivor who had refused to surrender to fear in the freezing darkness of the Atlantic Ocean. But Margaret herself never focused on the fame. Instead, she continued dedicating her life to the causes she had always believed in. In the years that followed, she remained deeply involved in social reform. She continued supporting workers' rights, advocating for women's equality, and speaking publicly about the need for greater compassion toward the poor and vulnerable. Margaret also continued her passion for education and culture. She traveled widely, studying languages and learning about different societies around the world. Her curiosity and energy never faded, even as she grew older. One of her most passionate causes was the fight for women's voting rights. At a time when women in the United States were still struggling for political equality, Margaret spoke openly about the importance of allowing women to participate fully in public life. She believed that society could only improve if women had the opportunity to shape its future. Her influence extended beyond politics as well. During World War I, Margaret traveled to Europe to assist with relief efforts, helping support wounded soldiers and civilians affected by the war. Her work earned her recognition from several international organizations for her humanitarian efforts. Throughout her life, Margaret Brown remained a woman who believed strongly in action. She believed that courage was not simply about surviving disaster, it was about using one's strength to help others whenever possible. When she passed away in 1932, the world remembered her not only as a survivor of the Titanic, but as a remarkable figure whose life had been defined by determination, compassion, and resilience. The story of the Titanic would always remain one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history. But within that story, the name of Margaret Brown would endure as something else entirely, a symbol of courage. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, individuals can rise above fear and help guide others toward hope. And that is why the world still remembers her today as the unsinkable Mrs. Brown.